Yo, Zio here, and I'm going to talk about quite a complex issue reading Black Ops 2 Zombies right now, which is related to sound system and people's games randomly freezing in high runs. I'm going to be referring to Transit for this video because that was what prompted the investigation, and more specifically Santos 2.11 game that froze. But do keep in mind what you hear about applies to the entire Black Ops 2 and only Black Ops 2, as Black Ops 1 and World at War are not affected by this issue. The reason the 2.11 game crashed is because of a string reference counter overflowing a 16-bit unsigned integer number. Let me try to unpack this for you. String reference is a connection between the string that lives in a mem tree, and yes, we're talking about the mem tree that errors on Origins Genstrat, and a zombie's entity. It can reference other things as well, but this is what are we doing with in this specific case. When it overflows, it becomes 0, which makes the game clear the mem tree slot. Then next time it's referenced, there occurs something that's called use after free in programming. The program reaches for something in memory that is no longer there, causing undefined behavior. Undefined behavior is one of the worst things that can happen to a program. Now I need to show you some of the game script so we can see what exactly is happening there. And don't worry, if you can't understand it, I'm going to explain the important parts. The function I'm showing is running through the entire lifetime of a zombie. It begins right as it spawns and it stops when it dies. We can see a while true statement, which means while condition in the parenthesis is true, do something. In this case, while true is true, go through the entire of the following code block. This is something we call an infinite loop. It will just run forever unless explicitly terminated. We can now skip to the very end of this code block, which is indicated by the curly braces, and we see self-thread maps mp zombies zm audio do zombies play vocals. What it does is it creates a new thread on self, and self is a zombie in this context, and the thread is a function do zombies play vocals from a ZM audio file. Let's now look at what this function does. At the very beginning we see self end on def statement, which means if self, which to remind you is a zombie in this case, receives an event called def, the thread ends instantly. In plain English, this line of code kills the thread when the zombie dies. Next, there is a lot of logic that's not important for what we're talking about. We actually go to the very end of this function and we see an if statement that has two branches. It says if this condition is true, run the code block in the curly braces underneath. Otherwise, if another condition is true, run the code block in curly braces underneath that. The second branch is what interests us. We see this is only going to happen if the zombie isn't already talking. Then we mark the zombies as talking, make it louder if it's the last zombie, and then comes the crucial part. Self plays sound with notify, with alias variable and sound done string in parentheses. Below you see self wait till sound done. What happens here is self, so the zombie, plays sound that has the alias held by the variable, and once it's done playing that sound, it sends an event to the zombie that is called sound done. And then we see the logic just waits for that event. Now I explained to you a piece of code, and there really isn't anything wrong with it at the first glance. But remember how I said it's the string reference overflow and the reference is to a zombie entity? We see here there's a string sound done, and it is referencing the zombie, because the sound is played by the zombie entity. Naturally, you would ask, alright, so if that reference isn't cleared properly, and each zombie has one, should the game not always die after 65,535 zombies have been killed, as this is the max value of a 16-bit unsigned integer? And no, because this system isn't broken in such a simple way. The game would face enormous instability issues because of that. The reason we're talking today is when the zombie dies between those two lines, so after it started to play the sound but before it finished playing it, only then the reference is not cleared. Let's go back to the part where it just repetitively runs in a loop. Notice how at the end it says wait random float range. This line of code means the loop halts for a random amount of time. The exact time it waits is randomized from values between 1 and whatever is held by the float value. In this case it's going to be 4, 99% of the time. Every time this loop reaches the end, it makes an attempt to make the zombie entity play a sound. However, it won't always succeed. There are a bunch of conditions in that function that make it just abort early, but it is safe bet to say the zombie spends most of its time on the map making sounds. If you kill it while it makes a sound, the reference to that sound done string is leaked. And by leaked, I mean permanently stored in the mem tree. It is also important to note, this persists across map restarts and fast restarts, so you need to restart the entire game to reset the reference counter. This also applies to the mem tree allocations in general. However, despite tens of thousands of references, this only allocates one slot in the mem tree. You're now seeing a small fragment of a mem tree dump from a recent 3-player game Unburied by Normal Man, and you can see there is only one sound done string in the entire dump. However, the number of references is near 45,000. Now you might be confused, because if you check the zombie count for the round they achieved in that 3-player game, you'll notice it's significantly higher than the amount of zombies that were in Santos' Transit game. And you're correct, in fact we're not sure about the exact reason for this yet. The discovery is relatively new, we've been looking into this actively for past few days. However, there is sure more to be discovered. Should we find more about this, or if any of you can figure out the reason, I will make sure to post an update in the comments or the description. The current leading theory is the timings of how long it takes between a zombie respawn and the moment of its death matters more than it would seem from looking at how randomized the whole playing sound system is. Somebody once said new plutonium makes transit more stable, and turns out they were actually right, and let me explain. There is a very specific security patch implemented in all versions of Redacted and Plutonium all the way up to release 4.5.16, and this patch actually makes the leak progress faster. To understand it, we need to dive even deeper. What you see now is a small part of actual game code, not the scripts but the game itself. Now I need you to look at the V8 variable. Notice how it first takes the duration parameter and then the code checks if it's lower than 0, and if it is, it sets it to 5000. This variable represents the duration of a sound that is about to be played. What the security patch did, it made the game just not see the duration. The entire system for informing it about the sunk left has been removed, which meant the reported duration has always been -1. As -1 is lower than 0, it would always set the V8 variable to 5000. So each sound would be interpreted as it was 5 seconds long, regardless of how long it actually played. On all the launchers, despite sounds actually playing, the code had no idea about the duration of the sound, so that sound down period of time would always be 5 seconds. Now let me show you how long are some of the most commonly sounds played by this function. Notice how one is just slightly longer than 5 seconds, but the other is below 3 seconds. This effectively makes the time window for leaking string reference quite a bit bigger on all the launchers. I have some results to show you. 4 test games were played, all of which were played on Stratester between rounds 100 and 105. However, 2 games of the left contain the old security patch added to the modern Plutonium for the purpose of this test, and on the right you see the state of the leak in a clean game. While the test games were only an hour each, they were played the same way world record attempts are played, so they should at least give you the idea about the scale of the situation. Remember, the actual record games are quite a bit longer and have much more random things happening in them, which is why the longest Plutonium and Redacted games are not as far from each other as this sample would indicate. It is yet another thing we recently found that exposes flaws in old launchers. Did I mention the behavior of current Plutonium version is consistent with Steam and console versions of the game, while Redacted and older Plutonium versions just randomly break it? But launchers politics is not a topic of this video. Let me now talk about ways people could exploit the game to gain unfair advantage on both consoles and Plutonium. Not to give people ideas, but to spark a conversation about how can the community handle it. First of all, tools for making custom sounds for Black Ops 2 have been public since 2013, which means swapping the relevant audio files for ones that are shorter is trivial. It is also possible to remove audio files completely. Black Ops 2 is able to work without them, which was quite a shock to us when we found out. But you can literally go to the game files on both PC and console, remove the files, and the length of the audio would be 0. This would make the window for reference count leak only last for 1 GSC tick, which is 20 Hz, which is 50 milliseconds. How can we protect ourselves against it? Without using new Plutonium, it is essentially impossible. We could require players to show sound folder, but as Black Ops 1 proved already, this can be circumvented and not really effective. It is however better than nothing, I guess. On new Plutonium we have some more options. Developers have already released an update that extends the checksum system to the sound files. This system will also be able to show sound files that are missing entirely. But in order for this to work, we need to ban using custom sounds in competitive play on Black Ops 2. I know this is a bummer to some people, but that's the only effective way of ensuring the integrity of the game. This is a good place to mention, speedrunning communities definitely should look into how custom sounds, and removing them, can affect the runs. Again, checksums are your friends here. B2GSC Center of course already has all the valid sound checksums registered for game validation. Plutonium is also prepared to ship a fix to this specific leak if players want to get rid of it completely, which will depend on an upcoming vote. This of course won't happen if the decision is to keep this leak in place. However, if you just want to play high rounds casually, you can always set the gfix and leaks dvar to 1 and have pretty much every single error in this game fixed. Regardless of that, the recent Plutonium patch has a separate counter for this specific string reference, so players can tell the current state of the allocations. It is much like the child variable counter, for example. You can enable this counter with cg draw sound down ref count dvar. Right, so here it is. We went from investigating a seemingly random freeze to uncovering a huge flaw in the way Black Ops 2 is handling the sound, as well as hidden float logic in old launchers. Now of course, we will never be able to tell for sure, but this is also most likely the reason for 236 mob game bar issues freezing. Here I would like to thank the Plutonium team for investigating this error, Wonderful for reviewing the script, and No Moment for doing a shitload of testing for us. At the end, I would like to emphasize again, this is a first discovery and there is for sure a lot more to find here. I'll post updates in the comments or description if we do. Thanks for watching and see you next time.